And looks like it only took a few weeks before another exciting update in regards to little red dots. The mysterious discovery from the James Webb Space Telescope that was first revealed only in 2022 and has since become one of the biggest mysteries in astronomy. And while ever since then, the James Webb Space Telescope has been showing us things we never expected to see in a lot of these locations in the very early universe. And this is one of the biggest mysteries so far. It basically involves hundreds, and specifically almost 400, of these somewhat tiny red glowing objects that appear very compact, relatively bright, and seem to also appear in almost every image produced by the James Webb, but only at extreme distances in the super early universe. And because even today nobody actually has any idea exactly what these are, they essentially now have been nicknamed LRDs, little red dots. And while obviously, initially, scientists believed that these were probably very young galaxies, most likely full of old stars. But following additional observations and additional analysis, that turned out to be not the case because they don't really produce the same emissions. And so since the original discovery, in just the last 4 years, researchers have found a lot of things about them. But this recent study that was just released and that we're going to be discussing today may have now solved one of the major mysteries, while at the same time completely redefine our previous assumptions about the early universe. Because the data from this particular study is actually very surprising. But first, super quickly, so why exactly are they so strange and what do we know about them so far? Well, first, in terms of size, they are incredibly small, only 2% of the radius of the Milky Way, or just a few hundred light years across. But their total brightness rivals a typical galaxy, implying that whatever is happening here has to be super energetic, because we're seeing this after the light traveled for at least 13 billion years, which is essentially almost at the edge of the universe. And after analyzing 340 separate objects, they all seem to have very similar properties. They all share a kind of a V-shaped spectrum. Or basically they seem to be very blue in the ultraviolet light, then have nothing in the middle, and then become extremely red at longer wavelengths. And because of these observations, and also because they basically produced so much energy, there were essentially two potential explanations, or at least two main propositions. First, these were extremely compact galaxies packed with stars, extremely close to each other, with the other side arguing that these were probably active galactic nuclei, or basically growing black holes, surrounded by a lot of dust. But additional observations with radio telescopes like ALMA revealed that, first of all, they don't really seem to possess that much dust, and many of them potentially barely have any dust. And on top of this, X-ray observations reveal that many of them do not produce X-ray emissions expected from a typical active black hole, or at least black holes that are actively eating and are actively producing very powerful emissions. Which is why in the last few years there's also been quite a few alternative explanations, some which actually kind of made sense. Some of the more exotic explanations suggested that maybe these are actually unusual black hole stars or quasi-stars. And in this model, a massive star collapses into a black hole, but instead of exploding, its outer layers stay intact. And the black hole then force feeds on the star from inside out, creating a kind of a glowing object much larger than the entire solar system. But from a distance, this unusual star would resemble a single red dot, with additional explanations suggesting that maybe these were giant black holes and were actually sort of surrounded by so much dust that it kind of formed this very thick cocoon that pretty much blocked most of the light except for red light and certain types of ultraviolet emissions. In other words, for the most part, whatever this was, it involved some really extreme explanations. And interestingly, some of the more recent studies we've discussed previously, with videos in the description, even potentially found something very similar much closer to us, but basically a version of this that has kind of evolved over time. In other words, astronomers believe they might have found certain objects that might have been little red dots in the past, and have now become something else. For example, objects referred to as blue dogs, or blue dust-obscured galaxies, may represent an evolved version of a little red dot, but at a slightly later time, with the proposition being that little red dots evolve into much brighter blue galaxies as they blow away some of the gas and become more blue. But interestingly, there was even a discovery of a barely visible galaxy extremely close to the Milky Way that seems to also possess unusual properties, implying a very massive central object and the overall compact size, with that particular object even suggested to be a kind of an ancient little red dot that possibly existed near the Milky Way a long time ago. But basically, as of June of 2026, right now we actually still have no idea exactly what most of these are, but at least some of them have now been potentially resolved. And specifically based on this very recent study you can find in the description, based on the analysis of a very famous little red dot, QSO-1, the object that was actually found inside this image of Abell 2744, also known as the Pandora's cluster, a cluster that's known to contain a lot of dark matter, and thus creates very beautiful gravitational lensing effects. And well, it just so happens that at least one of these objects that's gravitationally lensed turned out to be one of these little red dots. In other words, it allows us to see this object with a much higher magnification than usual, which in this case, for the first time ever, allowed scientists to perform a direct mass measurement of everything inside this object, and especially in its center, with the results essentially now challenging our entire understanding of how galaxies form, and of course how some of the black holes form as well. And so without further ado, so what's the actual discovery and the conclusion? Turns out it is a black hole. But in this case, because this object existed when the universe was only 700 million years old, what's really unusual here is the mass of the black hole and the mass of the entire object overall. But once again, studying such an object is actually very difficult and is usually impossible. But in this case, we got super lucky because this sits behind a massive cluster of galaxies inside the Pandora's cluster, with the overall warping effect from all of the mass in front of us makes this image much bigger by a factor of 6. And so this magnification allowed the international team led by Ignace Juotsbalis to use a technique referred to as spectroastrometry, which is essentially what you're kind of seeing here. Here they were able to map how fast hydrogen gas is swirling around the central point, with the motion showing us that something is orbiting the center, but in this case with what we refer to as Keplerian motion, or in other words, whatever is here seems to be moving in a very similar way to how planets orbit the sun, which is actually very different from typical motion in galaxies, as normally it's a lot more flattened and does not follow the same pattern. And this means that almost all of the mass in this case is concentrated in a single point at the center. Mostly because there's really no other way to explain why this contains Keplerian motion. Okay, so far so good, and so far I guess nothing unusual. Except for one strange fact. Whatever is in the center seems to be approximately 50 million solar masses. And that something very likely is a supermassive black hole, which for such an early time in the universe would be super difficult to explain. In comparison, that's about 12 times more massive than the central black hole in the Milky Way galaxy. But the part that sort of confused everyone and the part that really made no sense is when they measured the mass of everything else. Because the total mass of all stars and all of the gas surrounding the galaxy is estimated to be less than 20 million solar masses, which basically suggests that the black hole outweighs the entire galaxy by approximately 2.5 times. And it's this confirmation and this discovery that suddenly creates a major challenge for cosmology and for galactic models. And that's because in the local universe, a supermassive black hole usually only accounts for 0.1% of galactic mass, with some extreme examples maybe being around 1%, but even then it's usually super rare. In contrast, QSO-1 is thousands of times more overmassive compared to anything in the nearby space, with the astronomers now referring to this as naked black hole. And basically because it seems to have formed before the galaxy had a chance to develop around it. And the reason this matters is because this officially rewrites the overall timeline for the formation of galaxies, but more importantly, how we actually believe galaxies form. Because in the standard model of cosmology, galaxies form first, and black holes potentially grow slowly inside, coexisting with galaxies and co-evolving at the same time. This was mostly based on observations from the last 10 billion years, and is also mostly based on a lot of simulations. In other words, the assumption was always that black holes and galaxies increase in mass proportionally. But this object, QSO-1, definitively suggests that, at least in some cases, if not all cases, black holes definitely come first. And not only did everything start with black holes, they also seem to have started with ridiculously massive sizes, which confirms the proposition in regards to direct collapse models. Or basically, following the Big Bang in the early universe, it's quite likely that giant clouds of pristine gas directly collapsed into massive black holes without forming stars first and without forming anything except for an extremely dense massive object. And it was actually after that gas arrived, with stars forming afterwards. And this potentially also provides a very important piece of evidence for primordial black holes. Black holes that existed before anything else, very likely after the first microsecond following the Big Bang. And as we discussed in one of the previous videos, they might have actually even formed right before the Big Bang started, from the space-time that might have been in a slightly different phase, a kind of a crystalline phase. You can learn about this in a video in the description. And right now, a lot of evidence for this comes from the fact that the gas around this object seems to be near pristine and has not actually had a chance to evolve or to create supernova. This is basically almost entirely hydrogen and helium with less than 0.5% of heavier elements. And so this is an extremely young system that barely evolved at all and seems to just contain this massive black hole with some stuff around it. And it's actually because this is a naked black hole that it doesn't seem to produce enough X-rays to be visible to modern telescopes or to be visible in any other light except for red light and ultraviolet light, which basically makes this one of the most exciting James Webb discoveries in the last few years. But also makes little red dots one of the most significant finds in modern astronomy that seems to have already redefined our previous understanding and basically challenged modern cosmology, officially confirming the existence of primordial black holes and confirming that black holes most likely came first. But as we get more data from JWST or additional data from other telescopes like the Extremely Large Telescope, we might end up discovering that the early universe was a much more active and violent place than our models predicted. For now though, that's kind of all we know, and that's all of the evidence scientists were able to find. We'll definitely come back and discuss this more in some of the future videos. Until then, thank you for watching, subscribe, come back tomorrow to learn something else, support this channel on Patreon where you can find additional videos without any ads, and can DM me directly, or by joining a channel membership that grants you early access. You can also support this channel by buying the Wonderful Person t-shirt in the description below. Stay wonderful, I'll see you tomorrow, and as always, bye bye.